Whether it's the darkness of Mordor, the unspeakable horrors of Lovecraft, or the boiling energies of the warp, most fictional works set in a fantasy or sci-fi world have some degree of wickedness within them, and the Warcrow universe is no exception. Warcrow is Corvus Belli's medieval fantasy wargame set in the world of Lindworm, where the ever-looming dread takes the form of the fog. Now, as Corvus Belli has tasked me with kitbashing some of the miniatures from this range, I thought I would have a go at creating some miniatures that have succumbed to this corruption. Inside the introductory box, along with everything you need to start playing Warcrow, are two distinct factions: the fearsome orcs of the northern tribes and the straight-laced hegemony of Embersig. I settled on the latter of these two. The effect would be much stronger on a unit that is more uniform and pristine, giving the darker aspect something to contrast against. To begin this process of desecration, I use my scalpel to cut and scrape scratches and chips into the armour of 4 bucklermen. The plastic of these models is a little softer than some hard plastic, so these cuts were quite easy to make. I made some particularly large gashes in the shield to represent the metal being rent asunder, but never fully repaired. You may notice that I kept the parts separate for this step. This would make reaching these areas around the arms much easier. Once I'd finished adding some battle damage to each of the 4 bucklermen, I superglued their parts together. However, I did leave a couple of the sword arms detached. This was to allow me to add some more overt signs of corruption, specifically some arms and tentacles taken from the Warhammer Chaos Spawn kit. I began with this particular tentacle and axe combo, which nicely matched the pose of one of the bucklermen. It needed a little trimming to make it fit properly, which was done with a scalpel. Once I had things lining up, I made the bond permanent with a little superglue. This process was then repeated on a second model using a different bladed tentacle. It always pays to take a little more time selecting the exact tentacle here. Picking one that matches the existing pose can really help to blend the new parts with the original. To help make the transition from the miniature to the mutated arm, I decided to add a few scraps of torn fabric. Not only would this hide an otherwise obvious seam, it would also give the impression of the sleeve being torn as the arm transformed. To create these, I cut and mixed a little green stuff and rolled it into a thin sausage. This was wrapped around the joint before being softened and blended with a silicone-tipped sculpting tool. I made sure to use a little Vaseline here to keep the stickiness of the putty down. With the green stuff in place, my knife and sculpting tools were used to add a series of torn strips emanating from the shoulder. This process was then repeated on the second tentacle arm as well. Continuing with the green stuff, I decided to add a little extra detail to one of the non-mutated soldiers in the form of some fur. While not inherently evil, pelts and other trophies are often used across the more wicked characters in fiction. These detail was created by taking a roll of green stuff and pinching it at either end. I laid this across the shoulder and scoured in a crisscross pattern with my knife. These small diamond shapes were then shaped and formed into tufts of fur. Once the whole blob of green stuff had been covered with these tufts, the putty was left to cure overnight before I continued. Nothing says evil quite like a rack of spikes, so naturally I decided to add these to my bucklermen too. My process in creating these saw me start out by drilling some 1mm holes into the back of the armor. Into these holes, some lengths of 1mm plastic rod was superglued before being clipped down. I made sure to clip the rod a little longer than I intended, as these would be trimmed down further later on. Spikes were no good if you couldn't impale something on them though. To create a trophy rack of slain goody two-shoes, I took a few citadel skulls, drilled some 1mm holes all the way through, and placed them over the spikes with a blob of glue. Once these were in place, the tips of the spikes were then sharpened into points with my knife. This process was then repeated across a few of the other bucklermen's shoulder pads and shields. In a similar approach to my first step of adding battle damage, my final step would be to add some crude repairs to the armor. These were quite simple to create and were formed from a combination of plastic card and more plastic rods. The card was cut into small, rough shapes before a few dents and dings were added to the edges. The metal patches were superglued to a few points across the armor and were followed by a small length of plastic rod that was glued and cut down to form the appearance of a bolt. Not only would these rough patches of metal give the soldiers more of an irregular uniform, it would also contrast against the ornate detailing across those panels. With all 4 bucklermen completed, they were ready for a coat of paint. I began the painting with a black primer. It was applied with my airbrush, but any black primer would have worked just as well. The black primer would create an excellent starting point and help with creating the shadows in those darker recesses. My next step was an optional one. I continued with my airbrush to apply a light coat of Asmodeus Red from the Tooth and Coats range across the armor. While the final color of the armor wouldn't be red, this deep red coloration would help with achieving the bright bronze that I intended to apply over the next few steps. From here, I would switch to a regular brush and paint all of the armor panels across the four bucklermen with some Spartan Bronze. As with all of my base coats, I thinned out my paint with a little water and applied several coats. By building up the layers slowly, it created a more complete coverage and left me with an excellent starting point. To give the recesses a little more shading, I created a mixture of some Cygor Brown contrast paint and some airbrush thinner. This created a much less viscous paint that still had a strong pigmentation. When it was applied across the details, it pooled into the recesses. This darkened them down and helped to lift those details out. These details were then pushed even further with some edge highlights. I dragged a thin line of Dragon's Gold across the edges, which left me with a line of brighter gold. Following this, some small spots of the even brighter Glistening Gold were added to the corners of the armor where two edges met. Combined with the previous wash and highlight, the results were some more visible details that gave the effect of reflecting light. This same process was then repeated across the silver metallic details. These included the weapons, the spikes, and the extra armor details. This time around though, I selected Dwarven Iron for my base coat. Like with the earlier Cygor Brown wash, I created and applied a similar mix of Black Legion and airbrush thinner. The silver metallics were then finished off with some edge highlights of plate armor. With the metallics complete, I cleaned out my paint water and began work on the black areas of the models, specifically the cloth details. These were all given an initial base coat of Death Reaper, followed by some thin lines of Dungeon Stone Grey. And finally, a few small spots of Wizard Grey to pick out the sharper folds. The cloth was then followed up with a base coat of Scorched Earth across the leather details. These covered quite a few areas such as the gloves, boots, straps, and pouches. All of these areas were then edge highlighted with some Ancient Forest, before I finished them off with a few small spots of Wasteland Brown. For the skulls and wrapping around the axe handle, I started out with a base coat of Dragon Fang. But those recesses weren't quite dark enough for my liking, so I hit the Dragon Fang areas with a wash of Archaic Sepia. After the wash had darkened down the recesses, it allowed my following highlights of Skeleon Legion and then Vampire Fang to stand out even more. For my next step, I needed an accent colour, something that would tie in nicely to the theme of some fog-corrupted soldiers. Naturally, I settled on red. Using some Berserker Red, I base coated the mutations and a few smaller details dotted across the miniatures. To give the tentacles a little variation, I watered down some Berserker Red and Death Reaper. I coated the end of the tentacles with the thinned Berserker Red, and while it was still wet, I applied the Death Reaper to the tip. As both paints were still wet, I was able to blend the two together on the model to create a gradient with the end of the tentacle being a solid Death Reaper before steadily transitioning into the Berserker Red. From here, I returned to the red and began the highlights. These began with some Sanguine Scarlet, followed by a few small spots of Demon Red. With the red completed, I then returned to the same greys that I'd used earlier to highlight the darker Death Reaper parts of the mutations. To paint the small amount of skin around the faces, I began with a base coat of Dwarven Skin. Normally my go-to base coat for skin is Barbarian Brawn, but as I wanted to create a more pallid tone, I instead opted to use Dwarven Skin. This base coat was then followed by a wash of Flesh Wash. While this did darken down the tones slightly, its main job was to just darken down the recesses and help to bring out the facial details. These details were then further brought out with a highlight of Elven Skin, and then finished off with a few small spots of Ivory Tusk. Next, I tackled the hair and started with a base coat of Druid Flesh, washed with some Battle Mud Wash, before I began the highlights, using Paladin Flesh first, and finally some Bard Skin. To build upon that damaged and unkempt look of the armor, I decided to create a corroded effect in the bronze. This was achieved with the aptly named Verdigris. This is quite thin, but was a little stronger than the washes. This did allow me to apply it directly into the recesses though, to create the appearance of corrosion forming in patches. This was applied across the entirety of the armor and the shields, but I was quite sparing with my application. It can be quite easy to overdo this step, so try to approach the application steadily. With the model itself complete, my attention turned to the base. For the tactical rocks that the bucklermen were stood upon, these were base coated with wizard grey and washed with some Hellion Red to give them a slightly reddish hue that would work well with the rest of the basing scheme. I finished off the rock with some fine highlights of Carcharodon grey. The rest of the base was then coated with a thick layer of Fireland texture paste. This is probably one of my favourite basing paste because the colour is just incredibly vibrant. It also works nice as a nod to the red fog that corrupted these warriors in the first place. After allowing the paste to fully dry, the outer edge of the base was dry brushed with some Fanatic Orange, which helped to lift out the raised texture left behind from the paste. By focusing around the edges of the base, it created the effect of a shadow being cast by the miniature on the ground beneath it. I then followed this up with a dry brush of the even brighter orange flare, and this was used to cover a slightly narrower strip around the edge of the base than before. All that was left to do now was to finish off the bases with a few tufts of grass and apply a matte varnish, and I was left with this. And here we have the finished bucklermen, formerly of the hegemony of Embasig, but now fallen to the corrupting fog. Now whilst this video focused specifically on some of the miniatures from the Warcrow range, these techniques and ideas could easily be applied to pretty much any range of miniatures that you're looking to corrupt. Now, I just want to say a big thank you to Corvus Belli for sponsoring this video. Like I mentioned earlier, Warcrow is a medieval fantasy combat game designed for 2 players. The game is played with a series of units and makes use of simple dice and movement templates to make things easier to pick up and play. But the game is far from simple, as both your positioning and the game's narrative are incredibly important. Plus, the introductory box that these miniatures came from contains all the scenery, tokens, rules, and of course the miniatures that you need to start playing. If you'd like to learn more about the world, miniatures, and game of Warcrow, then you can find some links down in the description and comments below. You can also find the full list of kits and paints that I used to build these miniatures down there too, along with some affiliate links which help to support the channel. Speaking of supporting my channel, let me just say a huge thank you to everyone who already helps me out. In particular, my Pouch of Dead Animal Bits tier and above supporters who are Andrew Console, Axel Jonsson, Berserker, Bits of Wargaming, Chris Reynolds, Daniel Dowling, Gabe Benavides, Hugh Wright, Ilniro Galeri, Immaterial Creations, Maciej Savitsky, Molly Mork, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Nathan, Nima, Palejuice, Ryan Little, Splinkus, Swedsman, Tim, Tom Haysmith, and War Novice. And my Sergeant level channel members who are Underz, Coach Kato, Roll 1 to Explode, Set Thasset Aponsawat, The Sire Acquired, Lloyd Davies, Phoenix's Den, Trooper Geo, Mr. Jared Hess 95, David, John Gibbs, Philip Hoya, Nerdings and Paints, Mark Taylor, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.